prayers, and we heard somebody talk about Psalms, we talked about Psalms, and I said there's one very nice prayer that we say once a month when we're saying morning prayer, and that is from the Old Testament, the Song of Hannah. So we agreed that I would say something about the Song of Hannah tonight. In taking prayer from the Old Testament, really what we're doing is looking at one woman, her life situation, her struggle, and her prayer in the midst of that struggle, which can again give us some idea about how we bring to prayer the struggles that we meet in our own lives. So this is, and I will go into the story, but here you have visually a rather sad Hannah here on the left. And this is not a relation of Hannah's, this is her husband's other wife. So we're in a complicated situation. This man has two wives, and as you can see, the other wife has a happy family with children. Hannah has not. And this is part of the difficulty and the struggle that we're going to find her in, and we'll see how through prayer she copes and she deals with it. So for later on, if you, on the handout that I have provided for today, on the reverse side, there is the prayer of Hannah, and I will be going through some of that with you in a few moments, but it is there for later on if you want to use this prayer. So it's 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. So before we look at the prayer, I want to put it in a context for you. And that means doing a very quick little bit of Old Testament history. So let's go back to some of the key elements of the Old Testament. The Exodus. Again, you find this story dominates the Old Testament, and indeed it finds its way into the New Testament as well in our understanding of Jesus. We would date the Exodus at about 1250 BC. And followed by the Exodus was the settlement in Canaan, which most archaeologists would say is around 1225 BC. Don't worry about the dates. You have Exodus, you have the settlement in the land. And then there's a period of about 200 years, from about 1200 to 1000, when Israel has no central government. This is where we're going to pick up on Hannah's song. They have no central government. It's a period when the different tribes are being ruled by charismatic leaders called the Judges. And there's an entire book dealing with the cycle of Judges. The period of the Judges gives way to the period of monarchy. And Hannah's song is at that point where we're moving from the Judges to the monarchy. And you have a period of about 80 years where monarchy becomes strong in the life of God's people, and then you have followed that by the collapse of the whole thing. It collapses, and by about 586 BC, the monarchy has ended. So Hannah and her song comes at the period between the end of the Judges and the start of monarchy. Hannah, we will see, is the mother of the last of the Judges, namely Samuel. So if I give you that visually, the Exodus, 1250 BC, the Hebrews leave Egypt, they come to Mount Sinai where they're given their the commandments, and then wander in the Sinai Peninsula. The Bible says for 40 years, not to be taken literally, 40 just means a long time. They wander for a long time, and eventually they settle in the land. When they come to settle in the land, of course, the land that they settle in is not their land. So before they arrive, there are other peoples, the Philistines, the Midianites, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians. All of these occupy the land. But eventually Israel moves into the land, and the tribes settle in different parts of the land, and that's just a map of where all the different tribes settle. But there is no central government. There is no organized system of government. So for about 200 years, you have these characters, the Judges, who, as it were, govern each of these tribes and look after them. Some of them very well and some of them not so well at all. And the whole painful, chaotic story is told in the book of Judges. The last of those judges is Samuel, son of Hannah, and he is the one who, as it were, anoints the first king of Israel. The first great king, well, there's Saul, who's a bit of he doesn't last too well, and he doesn't get to do very, very much. The first great king is David, followed by his son Solomon, and they have this mini empire here. But after the death of Solomon, it all goes downhill. The kingdom breaks up into a northern and southern kingdom, and eventually these kingdoms disappear, and that is the end of monarchy. So Hannah then is the mother of the last of the judges, who will be the one to choose David, the first great king. So if you wanted to read these stories, for instance, in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, you'd get the account of the Exodus. In Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges, you'd get how the tribes came to settle in the land of Canaan. In 1 and 2 Samuel through to the first book of Kings, you have the story of the rise of monarchy, and finally in 1 and 2 Kings, you have the collapse of monarchy. So again, Hannah and her song and her prayer comes at the beginning of the rise of monarchy, at the end of the chaos of the judges. So I'm going to hand over to a little video now to introduce where Hannah fits into the book of Samuel. And I hope, I adjusted the volume earlier, I hope the volume is adequate for you to hear.
The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. There are two separate books in our modern Bibles, but that division is due simply to scroll length. It was originally written as one coherent story. We're just going to cover the book of 1 Samuel in this video. So after Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt, they made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai and eventually came into the Promised Land. And there Israel was supposed to be faithful to God and obey the covenant commands. Before the book of Samuel, Judges showed how Israel failed at that task big time. It was a period of moral chaos, and it showed Israel's need for wise, faithful leaders. The book of Samuel provides an answer to that need. The book of Samuel's story focuses on three main characters. The prophet Samuel, where the book gets its name, and then King Saul, and after that, King David. And all three of them transitioned Israel from a group of tribes ruled by judges into a unified kingdom ruled by King David in Jerusalem. And the book of Samuel has a fascinating design that weaves the story of these three characters together in four main parts. Samuel, he's the key leader and prophet in the first section of the book, but then he also plays a key role in the next section, which is Saul's story, and it's told in two movements: Saul's rise to power and then his failures. And the second part is about his downfall and his tragic death. And then the drama of Saul's demise is matched by David's exciting rise to power. And then David's story is told in two movements. First, he rides the wave of his success, followed by his own tragic failure and the slow self-destruction of his family and then his kingdom. The book concludes with an epilogue that reflects back over the whole story. So let's dive in and see how this all unfolds. Part 1 picks up from the chaos of the book of Judges, and we're introduced to a touching story about a woman named Hannah. And she's grieved because she has never been able to have children. And by God's grace, she finally has a son. And in joy, she sings this amazing poem in chapter 2. And the poem is all about how God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, about how despite tragedies and human evil, God is working out his purposes in history. And also it's about how God will one day raise up an anointed king for his people. Now Hannah's poem has been placed here at the beginning of the book to introduce these key themes that we're going to see throughout the whole story, like the next one. Samuel grows up and...
Okay, we leave Samuel to grow up. And what I would like to do is go back now and again another short little video which tells in more detail the story of Hannah and puts her prayer in context before we get a chance to read it. It's done in an amusing way, and I think you will enjoy it.
This story starts with a man named Elkanah. He was married to a woman named Peninnah, and also to a woman named Hannah. But the story isn't really about him. It's all about Hannah and how she prayed. Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not have any children, and this made her very sad. Between his two wives, Elkanah definitely loved Hannah the most. He would shower her with gifts and try to comfort her, saying, "I can be better to you than 10 sons could ever be." But even though he was very affectionate, Hannah just couldn't shake the deep disappointment of wanting to be a mother, but not being able to. What's worse is that any time Elkanah was away, Peninnah would make fun of Hannah. She would tell her that she was a failure, call her names, and say that maybe God just hated her. This went on for years. Hannah would try to have a baby, but would be unsuccessful. And Peninnah would mercilessly ridicule her. Finally, Hannah had enough. She went to Shiloh, the capital city, and went into the temple to pray. As Hannah prayed, she cried. She wondered why having a child, the one thing she wanted more than anything, seemed to come so effortlessly to everyone else. She also made a vow that if God would answer her prayer, she would raise her child as a priest, as a way of saying thank you. As Hannah was praying, a man named Eli saw her. Eli was the high priest, a big shot. And when he saw this strange woman in his temple, rocking back and forth and crying, he assumed she was drunk and told her to leave. But Hannah stood up for herself. She explained that she was not drunk, but that she was actually pouring out her heart to God. When Eli heard this and saw her faith, he reassured her that God would absolutely answer her prayers. And Hannah believed him. Perhaps for the first time, she really felt that God was on her side. After that, Hannah was genuinely happy, trusting completely that God does answer our prayers. She went home to her husband and a little while later became pregnant with her first child. She gave birth to a son named Samuel and was overjoyed. And she kept her promise to God, letting Eli raise Samuel as a priest. What changed for Hannah? In the past, her prayers might have started with herself. She might have thought, I want to be a mother. I deserve to be a mother. I would make a great mother, better than all those other mothers. Her prayers might have started with jealousy too. Why does Peninnah get to be a mother, and not me? But when Hannah made her vow to God in the temple, something was different. You might say that all those years she'd been praying, God had been listening, and he'd been exalting her desires, lifting them up until they became more spiritual. Now, Hannah's focus wasn't on herself anymore. It was on God. And that steadfast focus on God shut out all the fear and jealousy and despair she was feeling. In that moment, God really became the biggest thing in the room to her. After giving birth to Samuel, Hannah went on to have at least 4 more children. And in the very next chapter of the Bible, you can find a beautiful poem she wrote, expressing her heartfelt gratitude to God. Hannah's story shows the Bible's promise. Miracles can happen when you let God into your heart, and let him mold and exalt your desires into their glorious fulfillment.
Okay, with that in mind, let's take a little look at Hannah's prayer. I'm going to put the words of it up here on the slides. We'll just take 5 minutes of this. And afterwards, you have a copy of the prayer there on one of the pages. Hannah's prayer is an introduction to 1 Samuel, and it introduces the book both in terms of the theme that's going to be developed in the book, and offering some guidelines around the structure of the book. This is not a prayer of petition, so this is not like a prayer that you might read out or we might read out at the novena on a Thursday. It's not asking God for something. Rather, it's a prayer of praise and thanksgiving. And God is being praised as the one who reverses human fortune. We'll come back to that again. God is the one who takes situations of misery and pain and turns them into something else. It's the prayer of a woman who's caught up in an unequal struggle and who thanks God for the help received. So it's praise and thanksgiving to God. Now, the book has a very interesting structure. I put that word YHWH up there, Yahweh, because that's the way it's written in the Hebrew Bible, but in the translation, because Jewish people don't like to say that word, we tend to say the Lord, the Lord. So you've got the Lord's holy sovereignty, followed by Hannah outlining how human fortunes have been reversed, another statement of the Lord's holy sovereignty, followed by another statement about how human fortunes are reversed, a final statement about God's holy sovereignty, and then half a verse on the king. Remember, Samuel will be the one who will choose or anoint David as king. So let's dip into it now. My heart exalts in Yahweh, my horn rises in Yahweh. I'm going to use that word Yahweh, but aware of Jewish sensitivities. My mouth opens wide against my enemies, for I have rejoiced in your salvation. Now, I'm using a translation that brings you very close to the Hebrew. So you have some phrases there that are quite strange. My horn rises in Yahweh. Again, if you go back to the world of the Middle East in ancient times, the ancient Near East, the horn of an animal was a symbol of its strength and of its pride and of its dignity. So if you saw a picture of a stag with fine antlers, you'd immediately recognize the dignity of the animal, its strength, or an elephant with massive tusks, or even a rhinoceros, with those two horns. It would symbolize the strength of life, but the dignity of the animal. So as Hannah goes to prayer, and Fola has a lovely picture here, you won't be able to see it from the back of the room, but do come up and look at it, of her kneeling in prayer in the temple at Shiloh. And she goes there in dignity. Even though she's suffering, her dignity is maintained. And the enemies that she talks about is not this other woman, Penina, who has been giving her a lot of hassle and grief through her life. The enemies are those who have been attacking Hannah for putting her trust in God. In other words, those who are saying you're a fool to put your trust in God, you're never going to have a child, you're going to always be in this situation. They are the enemies. And she opens her mouth against those because why? She rejoices in God. She knows, as she says this prayer, that she has an intimate, personal relationship with God. And that's the key for her, that she has such a thing, an intimate, personal relationship with God. So she recognizes God's power, God's sovereignty. So then she goes on to say, there's no holy one like the Lord. Indeed, there is none but you. There is no rock like our God. So she makes a number of convictions, makes a number of statements about God now. There is no holy one like Yahweh, like the Lord. Again, this is a very strong idea in the Old Testament, that God is beyond us. God is incomparable. There is nothing in the universe that can compare to God. God is unique and has no rivals. And what makes the God of Israel unique in the Old Testament is the God of Israel can change history. The God of Israel can change events. Turn bad events into good events. Can turn good events into bad events. Now at this point in the history of Israel, people are not yet saying there is one God and God alone. What they're saying is there are many gods, but we give our worship to the Lord alone, the God of Israel. So Hannah's prayer is the prayer of one who recognizes that there might be other gods, but the God of Israel, there is no God like the God of Israel. There is no one but you in terms of what you can do. And what you can do is to change historical events. She also says that there is no rock like God. The rock is a very common description of the Lord in the Old Testament. And she talks about our God. So she's not just praying as she goes into the temple. Yes, she has desperate need, but she's praying as one who is part of a community. She is part of the community of Israel. Then we move on. She says, "Do not speak too much very haughtily. Let no arrogant word go out of your mouths. For Yahweh is the God of true knowledge." So she now addresses the community of Israel in her prayer. And she, as it were, in her prayer, admonishes the community of Israel and tells them how they should behave before the God of Israel. The God of Israel is an all-knowing God, and his actions, his deeds are immeasurable. In other words, what God does is awesome. And here is this woman in this terrible situation, recognizing that God is an awesome God, and that what God thinks and what God does is beyond human comprehension. The mighty, their bows are broken. The feeble are girded with strength. She remembers what the results of Yahweh's deeds are. And it's by contrasting the mighty and the feeble. The mighty are broken. The feeble are given strength. You see the mighty, feeble, broken strength. The mighty are broken, the feeble are given strength. God reverses situations. This is the God to whom she is praying and whom she is praising. So the mighty lose their power while the feeble get strength. So again, God is the God who reverses life situations, and she has experienced that, or she longs to experience that in her own prayer. That God does this in a way that goes beyond human understanding and sense. Those who are sated with bread are hired, and those who are hungry need not be so forever. A barren woman bears 7, but a woman with many sons becomes childless. Again, you see the reversals. Those who are hungry, they now have food. Those who had plenty of food, they now have to hire themselves out to earn the money to get food. A woman who once considered herself to be barren has 7 sons. And a woman who had the ideal number of sons for a woman to have in this culture. But a woman who has many sons becomes childless because she loses them in the course of her life. They die. So again, you have these reversals. It is God, Yahweh, who brings death and makes alive, the one who brings down to Sheol and brings up. So again, we have God who changes, who has all of this power. God has total sovereignty or authority over life and death. Now, for the people of Israel at this stage in the development of their faith, they had no belief in an afterlife. What they believed was that when you died, you went to this place under the earth called Sheol, and there you lived as a kind of a shadow being, a dusty place. So it is God who controls all of this, life and death. He is the one who makes poor and makes rich, who makes low and also makes high. Again, you have these reversals going on. He is the one who raises the poor from the dust. From the dunghill, he's able to lift the needy. I hope at this stage you're hearing echoes of another prayer somewhere else, because this will become a template for Luke in his Gospel because Luke's gospel is all about reversal of fortunes. Those who are on the margins now become central in God's plan as Jesus does his mission, and those like the Pharisees who thought they were central are really marginal to God's plan. So you have Mary sing a similar kind of song in the Gospel of Luke. So again, what God does here is he lifts the needy from the dusty, and he gets them to sit with nobilities, and a chair of honour is granted. Again, this is outlining the power of God. The pillars of the earth are God's, and he has placed them on the world. So God is in charge of all of the creation. God has set the creation as it is. So again, for ancient Israel, oh my laser won't work on that screen, that's why I brought this old-fashioned thing. The pillars of the earth, this is how people understood the earth, that it was based on these pillars. God is responsible for all of this. This is the great creator God, and he has done all these things. So this is the God you can come to in prayer. He guards the feet of those who are faithful, but those who are not, they wicked and perish in darkness. So again, you see the reversal. No one can prevail by his own ability. By the power of God that we prevail. As for God, his antagonists are shattered. This is military type language. He thunders against them from heaven. So he will act as a warrior against those who are opposed to his sovereignty. And he judges the ends of the earth. And finally, she mentions the king. May he give power to his king. Again, she's saying more than she knows. Samuel will be the last of the judges. He will be the one who will usher in the monarchy under King David. So obviously this is a prayer that goes really way back in the history of Israel to a time before David as king. And finally, may he raise the horn of his anointed. May his power, his prestige, his dignity be raised. So that is the song itself. I can't take you through praying the song now because it's maybe time for Foley to come. But what I've put on the back of this sheet, on the front of this sheet, is maybe a way to pray the prayer that you might try during the week. Take some time of quiet reflection to yourself, and maybe think of ways in your life in which you've experienced God's power. Maybe you've experienced it in your own life. Maybe you've experienced God's power in the world or in the church. And if you have, in your own words, praise and thank God for it. And then think of an event or events in your life where God has reversed the fortunes of your life. And again, turn your heart in praise and thanks to God for that. And then maybe you might try to imagine that you are Hannah in the midst of your life's struggles and break forth in song. I'm going to let it end with the prayer being prayed here on the video in a moment. Fola had asked me to do make some homework suggestions. So what I suggest you might do too during the week is get out your Bible, read Luke chapter 1. Zachariah and barren Elizabeth. Luke is saying, watch out. Whenever you come across so-called barren women in the Old Testament, watch out. God's power will be at work. So read Luke 1 and read the first 2 chapters of the book of Samuel and compare and contrast. Where do you see the points of contact? Because Luke very deliberately is using the opening chapters of Samuel as he tells the story of Elizabeth and Zachariah. And what do you think Luke is trying to do at the beginning of his gospel? Really what he's trying to do, and here's the hint, is he's going to take you, the reader, through a whole theology of the God who reverses fortunes. And this will be very obvious in Jesus' ministry. And again, you might just think of how in the ministry of Jesus does Jesus signal that God is a God who reverses fortunes. So maybe, because we can't take the time to actually pray the psalm, we might just settle ourselves for a moment after all that information and just let this little singing of the song take you through it and once again remind you of its power as a powerful prayer.
barren has borne 7 babes, but she who has many is forlorn. The Lord kills and the Lord brings to life, brings down to the grave, raises up. The Lord makes poor and He makes rich. He brings us low, also exalts. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap, to make them sit down with princes and to inherit an honorable seat. The pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them He set the world. He watches o'er His holy ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in the dark. For not by might does one prevail, the Lord's adversaries shall be shattered. The Most High will thunder in heaven, the Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to His king and exalt the power of His anointed ones.
I've gone on too long. Let's take that as our praying of it, because Fola still has a presentation to make, so I'd like to hand over to her rather quickly. So apologies for going a little bit beyond my time.